Welcome to Empathy Stories, the channel where we uncover remarkable tales of resilience, compassion, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. Today, we bring you the unforgettable story of Laura, a woman who faced unimaginable betrayal but found an unexpected savior in the most unlikely of places. Stay tuned for a journey of hope, courage, and redemption. Nestled in the rolling plains of Montana, where the golden sun kissed the grasslands every morning, there lived a quiet woman named Laura. Life had not been kind to her in recent years. Once a vibrant and independent person, a sudden accident had confined her to a wheelchair, forcing her to rely on her husband, Brian, for even the smallest of tasks. Brian, however, was far from the supportive partner Laura needed. His love had soured over time, replaced by resentment and frustration. Brian was a man hardened by his own insecurities. He had always been proud of his ranch, his independence, and his ability to take on life's challenges. But when Laura's accident happened, he saw her not as a partner in need of support but as a burden, a reminder of what he felt he had lost. Over time, his affection faded, and what remained was a cold indifference that Laura could feel in every passing glance. One crisp autumn morning, the atmosphere in their modest ranch felt unusually heavy. Laura noticed Brian's quiet demeanor as he wheeled her outside. She thought perhaps he was finally going to take her to enjoy the fresh air by the fields, something she hadn't done in weeks. Instead, he guided her toward the barn, his pace steady but devoid of tenderness. Laura felt a chill run down her spine as they entered the dimly lit space, the scent of hay and animals enveloping her. Inside the barn stood Thunder, a towering stallion with a powerful build and a reputation for being difficult to handle. Thunder was a wild horse at heart, spirited and sometimes aggressive, which made him a challenging animal to manage. Brian had always spoken of Thunder with equal parts pride and frustration. As Brian brought Laura closer to the stall, her unease grew. Something about his silence, the set of his jaw, and the coldness in his eyes made her heart race. He stopped the wheelchair near Thunder's stall, turned on his heel, and walked away without a word. For a moment, Laura sat frozen, confusion swirling in her mind. Then the realization hit her like a thunderclap. He was leaving her there alone with the horse. A mix of fear and disbelief gripped her as she watched Brian step back, his figure silhouetted against the barn door. Brian's plan was cruel in its simplicity. He had convinced himself that Thunder's unpredictable nature would do the job for him, sparing him the guilt of taking any direct action. He had rationalized it in his mind as nature taking its course, a way to free himself from the weight he believed Laura's presence placed on him. He waited outside, his arms crossed, eyes scanning the horizon as though trying to ignore the gravity of his actions. Inside the barn, Laura sat motionless, her mind racing. Thunder turned his massive head toward her, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. She held her breath, paralyzed by fear. Her hands trembled as she gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, expecting at any moment for the horse to rear up or lash out. But what happened next was something no one could have predicted. Thunder, instead of charging or displaying aggression, slowly approached Laura. His hooves made soft, deliberate sounds on the barn floor. Laura's breathing quickened as the horse lowered his head and sniffed her gently, as though he were trying to understand her. Then, with surprising tenderness, he nuzzled her shoulder. The warmth of his touch, so unexpected and kind, brought tears to her eyes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Laura felt seen, not as a burden or a source of frustration, but as a fellow being worthy of care. Thunder's gentle act of compassion began to melt the icy grip of fear that had held her captive. It was as if the horse understood her pain, her loneliness, and her longing for kindness. Outside, Brian remained oblivious to the moment of connection happening inside the barn. His cold calculation and heartless plan had failed to account for the unexpected, for the possibility that even an animal could show more humanity than he ever had. As the minutes ticked by, the seeds of an incredible story were quietly taking root. A story that would challenge the very foundations of Laura's world and reveal the true depths of love and empathy in the unlikeliest of places. As Laura sat in the barn, her heart still pounding, she could feel the immense warmth radiating from Thunder. The stallion, known for his untamed spirit, had shown her something no human had in years: empathy. His nuzzle against her shoulder wasn't just a gesture, it felt like reassurance. A silent promise that she wasn't alone. Laura raised her trembling hand and hesitated before lightly resting it on Thunder's muzzle. The horse remained still, his deep eyes watching her as though he understood everything she was feeling. Tears streamed down Laura's face, not just from relief but from the overwhelming realization of how far she had fallen in her marriage. The one person who was supposed to stand by her in sickness and health had abandoned her in the cruelest way. And yet, here was Thunder, a creature many deemed dangerous, offering her more compassion than she had received in years. At that moment, Laura felt a surge of courage. She began to speak to the horse softly, her voice cracking but steadying with each word. "You're not the monster he thinks you are. Are you?" she whispered. "You're kind. You see me, don't you?" Thunder snorted softly, as if in response, and pressed his head gently against her hand. For the first time in years, Laura felt a glimmer of hope. If even this wild horse could recognize her worth, perhaps she hadn't truly lost herself. Outside, Brian leaned against the barn wall, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He felt a strange unease creeping into his chest, though he couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the silence emanating from the barn. He had expected chaos, sounds of fear, panic, or struggle, but all he could hear was the soft rustling of hay. The absence of noise made him restless. He turned to glance toward the barn door but stopped himself. "It's done," he muttered under his breath, as though convincing himself. Yet, a nagging feeling lingered. At that moment, a passerby, a local farmer named Hank, approached on horseback. Hank was an older man, known for his straightforward nature and keen sense of observation. He noticed Brian standing stiffly by the barn and raised a curious eyebrow. "Morning, Brian," Hank greeted, his tone casual but watchful. "Everything all right?" Brian stiffened, forcing a strained smile. "Yeah. Just tending to the horses." Hank's eyes drifted to the barn door. "That so? Thunder giving you trouble again?" Brian shrugged. "Something like that." Hank dismounted and began walking toward the barn. "Mind if I take a look? I've been meaning to see that stallion of yours. Heard he's a handful." Before Brian could protest, Hank was already pushing open the barn door. The sight inside stopped him in his tracks. There, in the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the wooden slats, was Laura in her wheelchair, her hand resting on Thunder's muzzle. The stallion stood calm and steady, his massive frame bent slightly as if to protect her. The scene was surreal, gentle, even sacred. Hank's face darkened as he processed what he was seeing. His sharp eyes darted back to Brian, who had followed him inside. "What the hell's going on here?" Hank demanded, his voice low but charged with anger. Laura looked up, her face pale but determined. "He left me here," she said, her voice trembling yet filled with resolve. "He wanted Thunder to get rid of me." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Hank's jaw tightened as he turned back to Brian, whose expression had shifted from false confidence to unease. Is that true, Brian? Hank asked, his tone now dangerously calm. Brian stammered, his usual bravado crumbling. I don't know what she's talking about. She's confused. Hank raised a hand to silence him. Save it. I've seen enough. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and dialed the local authorities. Sheriff? You'd better get down to Brian's ranch. We've got a situation here. Brian's face drained of color. He tried to protest, but Hank's glare silenced him. Don't even think about running, Brian. You've got a lot to answer for. As they waited for the authorities to arrive, Hank knelt beside Laura. Are you all right? He asked gently. Laura nodded, though her voice was still shaky. I think so. Thunder, he saved me. Hank glanced at the stallion, his expression softening. Looks like he's got more sense than some folks. He turned back to Laura, his voice steady. You're safe now. We'll make sure of it. When the sheriff and his deputies arrived, Brian was taken into custody without much resistance. The truth of his cold and calculated plan shocked the small community, sparking outrage and disbelief. Meanwhile, Laura was taken to the local hospital to be examined, both physically and emotionally shaken but grateful to be alive. As the commotion settled, one thing became clear to everyone who heard the story: Thunder, the horse Brian had hoped would carry out his cruel plan, had become a symbol of compassion and loyalty. And for Laura, his unexpected kindness marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would rebuild her life on a foundation of strength, hope, and the lessons she had learned about the resilience of the human spirit. The morning sun spilled through the windows of the small hospital room where Laura sat, her wheelchair parked beside a table adorned with a modest bouquet of flowers from the sheriff's office. It had been a few days since that fateful encounter in the barn, and the weight of it all still lingered in her heart. Yet, for the first time in years, she felt something else taking its place, a quiet determination to start anew. Her hands rested lightly on the arms of the wheelchair as she gazed outside. The autumn leaves danced in the breeze, a vivid reminder that even in the harshest seasons, beauty could still thrive. Laura closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun touch her face, and thought about Thunder. The horse's unexpected kindness had sparked something within her, a realization that she had worth, that she was not defined by her circumstances or by the cruelty of others. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Hank standing there, his weathered face softened with a kind smile. In his hand was a small bag of fresh apples. Thought you might like these, he said, stepping into the room. They're from my orchard. Figured you might want to share them with a friend. Laura smiled, understanding immediately. Thunder, she said softly. Hank nodded. The sheriff's folks have been taking care of him since, well, you know. He's doing fine. But I think he's been missing you. Laura's throat tightened at the thought of the stallion who had saved her life. I'd like to see him, she said, her voice resolute. He gave me a second chance. It's only right I thank him. Hank's smile grew. That's the spirit. I'll bring the truck around. The drive back to the ranch was quiet but peaceful. Hank told her about the buzz around town. The story of the horse that defied his supposed nature to protect a vulnerable woman had spread like wildfire. People were outraged at Brian's cruelty but inspired by Thunder's unexpected compassion. The sheriff had assured Laura that Brian would face justice. And though the betrayal still stung, she felt a sense of closure knowing he could no longer harm her. When they arrived at the ranch, Laura's heart swelled at the sight of Thunder in his paddock. His dark coat gleamed in the sunlight as he trotted toward the fence, his ears pricking up as if he recognized her instantly. Hank helped her out of the truck, and she wheeled herself closer to the paddock, her bag of apples resting on her lap. "Hey there, big guy," Laura said softly, her voice carrying a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Thunder approached her, his powerful frame moving with surprising grace. He lowered his head, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed at the apples. Laura laughed, a light, genuine sound that surprised even her. "I brought you a treat," she said, holding out one of the apples. Thunder took it gently, his soft lips brushing against her palm. Hank watched from a distance, his arms crossed as he leaned against the fence. "Looks like he's already forgiven the world," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time you do the same." Laura turned to him, the word settling in her heart. She nodded slowly, realizing the truth in them. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had happened, it was about freeing herself from the weight of anger and fear that had held her down for so long. Over the next few weeks, Laura began to rebuild her life. The local community rallied around her, offering support and encouragement. Hank introduced her to a friend who specialized in equine therapy. And soon, Laura found herself spending her days working with horses, learning to trust again through their quiet, steady presence. Thunder became her constant companion, his loyalty and gentleness reminding her every day that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found. One crisp autumn afternoon, Laura stood in the paddock with Thunder, the leaves swirling around them in shades of gold and crimson. She ran her fingers through his mane, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You saved me," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "And now it's my turn to save myself." The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but Laura knew she was no longer the fragile woman who had been left to face her fate in a barn. She was stronger now, forged by pain but not broken by it. With Thunder by her side and a newfound sense of purpose, Laura was ready to embrace the life she had always deserved, one filled with hope, compassion, and the unshakable belief that even in the bleakest moments, redemption was always possible. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey with Laura and Thunder, a story that reminds us of the power of kindness and the resilience of the human heart. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories for more inspiring tales that uplift and inspire. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next heartwarming story. Together, let's continue to celebrate the strength of empathy and compassion in our lives. See you in the next video.